Well, g'day Vine Church. Michael Kellahan is my name. I'm the Executive Director of Freedom of Faith. Thanks to Toby for inviting me here to be with you in this strange Zoom way, and for us together to be looking at how it is that we can be Christians in a public way, in a political way. And when Toby and I first spoke about this issue, the question we were kicking around was, what do we say when people say, Christians shouldn't impose their views on society, their morality, their beliefs? And that's certainly a question we've had thrown up at Freedom for Faith quite a bit. In the context of religious freedom debates, in the context of marriage debates, one of the common points of pushback has been, don't you impose your morality on us. You don't have a right to do that. It's kind of one of those conversation stopper moments. And so Toby and I had spoken about that issue and how it is we might approach that, what might be helpful. But since that conversation, it feels like the world has changed a lot. Since that conversation, we've seen the most unbelievable things happen in such a concentrated, short period of time. The last month has seen the killing of George Floyd and enormous protests and riots take place throughout the world. It's seen Trump standing in front of St. John's Church, an Episcopalian church, an Anglican church, with a Bible, not saying anything, with a closed Bible. It's seen enormous protests take place, riots take place throughout the states, but also kind of throughout the world. We've seen that happen in our own city, and calls for more protests to take place. We've seen a movement of statues being torn down, of people wanting to remove the racist evil past that has been turned into granite. But in the middle of it all, you see the event that kicks it off is the killing of a man at the hands of the police. A killing which is filmed and put onto social media. And before I even was aware of what had happened, my kids had seen it. And I'm assuming many of us have seen those terrible, awful last minutes of this man's life. And his life being taken away from him as a policeman kneels on him, and as he struggles to breathe, and as he says, I can't breathe. The awful thought, of course, is that as terrible as this event is, you wonder how many more events like this haven't been filmed. And you can't see this as just an American story. We know all too well of the deaths in custody here and issues which are before us. A good friend said to me this week, I don't feel like I'm ready to think about this. I just feel numb. I feel fatigued. I feel despair at the world. I just don't know what to do. So in this moment, it felt wrong to kind of give the talk I was going to give on how it is we should think about public square engagement and what we should do with questions of religious freedom. So I've thrown that talk out, and I've started to sketch something that speaks into the moment that we're in now. And I really don't want this to be seen as like, here's the finished product on this, but rather as something which hopefully can help you think about how you can speak better about this issue and how we can do that better. I want to say, though, at the start that aching for justice and anger at injustice is a good thing, and it's not confined to Christians. We see a world which is saying enough to the terrible things we've seen, and at times like these, we must come together to seek God's help his comfort, his strength and his wisdom, to pour out our grief and sadness before God and to come to his word. And during this week I've been reading from the Psalms, and the reading that we've had this morning has been Psalm 98. And in Psalm 98 there is a call for the world to sing, and to sing with joy. And I know singing is banned at the moment, joy or otherwise, but the psalmist in Psalm 98 says, sing. And the call goes out beyond just Israel sing to the nations, to the world, even to the mountains are to sing about God who has displayed his righteousness. And because he's displayed his righteousness, his justice, the nations should sing. The vision which is here, and the revelation we have, is that God's justice is something that rolls out to the very ends of the world. It's something which is going to overcome the nations and their injustice, and something which they're to bend the knee to in praise and adoration of him. The last verse of the psalm says, "Let them sing before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He'll judge the world in righteousness and the peoples with equity." See, the source of joy for the psalmist is the coming judgment of the earth by God. That can only take place because God is not a tribal deity that belongs just to the Israelites, but he is the Lord of all, who rules the earth and rules over the kings of the earth, and whose kingdom is going to be established and whose justice is going to come. Now, of course, God's people have that as a promise. It's not something that they experience. Most of the history of God's people through the scriptures is one of slavery, is one of oppression, from Egypt to captured exiles in Babylon, to being under the Assyrians, to the Roman Empire. Again and again, God's people suffer as a race under foreign oppression, and they're powerless, humanly speaking, to change their circumstances. They have a promise that God will come, that he will judge, but they wait for that day. And even when Jesus comes and announces the coming kingdom, there is still a sense of a waiting for the kingdom which is yet to come. After the resurrection, the first question the disciples have in the book of Acts is, "Lord, at this time are you going to restore the kingdom in Jerusalem?" They're looking forward to, at last, this moment of justice, of vindication, of righteousness, of the ending of wrongs and oppression, and a fixing up of all the things which are broken. But that's not the agenda which Jesus has. Instead, he sends them out, empowered by his Spirit, as witnesses to the world. And he sends them out beyond Jerusalem and Judea, out beyond Israel, to Samaria, to the very ends of the earth, to the Gentile world, to the Romans. And by the end of the book of Acts, you've got Paul in house arrest in Rome, but the gospel going forward freely. See, there's a picture of that tension, that waiting for the final justice which is to come. Now, I just wonder whether some of our angst and fear and concern and feelings of helplessness come because we've put our trust in the wrong things, because we've looked for political leaders from the left or the right to be the ones who bring about justice, who'll bring about righteousness, who'll bring about a dealing with the sins of the fathers, instead of seeing the way that God is the one who promises to do that. I think too often we shirk away from that sense of God's final judgment as a source of real hope, and we leave people despairing. We leave people thinking, well, how else can I find justice? I need to tear down a statue. I need to put a tyrant in place. I need to do this desperate political thing right here and now, because this is my only hope. Now, do not mishear me. I'm not saying that in this moment we're to say that, well, justice is final and God will fix everything up in heaven. So earth is just we're not interested in that. We just withdraw from that in some pietistic kind of way. No, it's because there is a coming judgment and there is a God who rules over the world that we can hope in this world, and we can say that what happens in this world matters. We see too that he's the one who has established kings and rulers. So Romans 13 says that the rulers are given the sword in order to do justice. There's a delegation of responsibility that comes for rulers to do God's work of establishing justice over the people that they have responsibility for. Now, if that can be said by Paul of Nero, of such a terrible Caesar, then we need to think far more carefully about the way God is at work through earthly rulers, even ones that we may never want to kind of vote for, who've been entrusted with a responsibility for judgment and who will be held to account for it. See, in Romans 13, Paul puts that out, prophetically. It's actually a word that reminds the church of who they are, but also it's a reminder to the rulers of their responsibility to one above them. They're not divine. They're not all powerful. They've been given the sword, yes, but they've been given it in order to do justice. And so we live as people who still wait for a kingdom, and there's going to be a delay to the time when we see all things made right and an accountability to rulers now to judge with justice. Now, let's be clear. Nothing I've said so far is this is how Christians should speak necessarily. I'm not saying this is, boil this down to a tweet and start putting it out there. Rather, I'm saying if we don't have these biblical kind of foundations in place, we won't have the right places to stand. And so that first foundation is really an understanding of God's kingdom and his rule over the world and his justice being something which needs to be established. And a second foundational truth, which I think we need to be very clear on, is that racism is a terrible evil. Do we need to say that? Why, though, do Christians particularly say that? Well, we say that because we know that people are made in the image of God. And so all people are precious to him and all, in one sense, are one. That Christian belief has not always been accepted by all cultures through all time. In fact, it's been controversial even in the history of Sydney. Mainstream 19th century beliefs, particularly towards the end of the 19th century with the rise of Darwinism and social Darwinism, would not accept primitive kind of beliefs that all people are one, but rather said, look, there is a hierarchy of different species, and in our context, the leading elites of the day said that Aboriginals were subhumans, said that they were a different species. And that is not just a kind of fringe, redneck wonderland kind of group. This is the elites who would be pushing this belief. After the Mile Creek massacre, one of the jurors said, "I look on the blacks as a set of monkeys, and the sooner they are exterminated from the earth, the better. I would never consent to hang a white man for a black man. I knew well they were guilty of a murder, but I, for one, would never see a white man suffer for shooting a black." See the logic which is at play here. These people aren't really human. These blacks don't actually have the same right to life that a white man has. The Attorney General at the time brought a second trial. He was a devout Catholic, one of the founders of St Vincent's, and Sidney Grammer, one of the early Vice-Chancellors at Sydney Uni. And he was a devout Catholic and believed that all people should be equal before the law, and was quite explicit in the way that Christian belief was to say These are our brothers and sisters. Aboriginals are humans. You know, for all the things the church has got wrong in its history in Australia in dealing with the First Nations, this they got right. They stood up against the elites of the time, against the popular views, against the powerful people, to say these people are in the image of God just as much as we are. And one of the key verses they went to and kept speaking from, and you can see this in the newspapers of the time, you can see it in the diaries, in all sorts of places, is the words of Acts 17:26. From the King James reads, "God hath made of one blood all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth." It's much stronger language than the modern kind of, you know, God has made all people one or something wimpy like that. One blood is what it says. It's very visceral. It's in the DNA that says we are all human. We human beings share one blood. It's a powerful image, and it's also the title of, by the way, one of the best books on the history of encounters between Aboriginal Christianity and the settlers, called One Blood by John Harris. It's out of print, but you can find it just for $10 on Kindle. And every Australian should read this book. If you do anything from this talk, go click onto Amazon, buy One Blood and read it. It will change your life. But at the time there, Christians are speaking up and saying it's evil to deal with these people as less than human. And similar conversations happening in the States in terms of slavery, where Christian belief is actually informing the understanding of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to belong. So second kind of really important foundational belief is why is it that we say that this matters so much? It's because people are in the image of God. And so bringing those thoughts together, we've got to connect that with our own history and thinking about the lands we're on and the place we've grown up and the place we have in this story. My own family history actually is, I grew up on a farm in Bathurst, and Bathurst's history, 1815, Evans crosses the mountains following Blackson, Lawson, Wentworth, and establishes what will become Bathurst on the banks of the Macquarie there. Establish pastoral grounds to feed the colony in Sydney. 1850s, they discover gold, and there's a massive gold rush that takes place. And then 20th century, there's Mount Panorama and Peter Brock. There you go. There's Bathurst history. But the history actually is a little bit more complicated than that. The farm that we were on, the title for it had gone through just one other family before it went back to Evans, the original explorer who's given the land grant over the area. And so he was given a land grant of thousands and thousands of acres there. And that history that tells nothing of the people who lived there leaves out the history of what was known in the colony in 1824 and 1825 as the Bathurst Wars. Martial law is declared, and there's curfews and there's guerrilla warfare that's taking place, and there's massacres that take place at sites that I know but didn't know were massacre sites all around town. Literally thousands of people who were killed in these Bathurst Wars. The massacre of men, women and children in their hundreds at just one site. And we got the land as a family. We kind of benefited from that history. What do we do with that? How do you understand it? What sense do you make of it? And at that point, it becomes tricky. And as a nation, I think we need to do better at understanding our history, the good bits and the bad bits, and actually understanding what's going on. And seeing that the outrage which has taken place at the moment with statues is something that is people wanting to deal with racial injustice. And we should be people who share that concern and who want to think carefully about how we fit into that story. And one way to think about it would be this, to say, how do we deal with the sins of our fathers? It won't do to come from the right of politics and to say, this wasn't us, this had nothing to do with me, this is not something we should ever apologise for. It won't do to come from the left and to say the problem is just one of power and of removing the people who have power because of their racial identity now. And we just tear down some statues and build this utopian kind of future. It seems that the scriptures actually have a much richer and more helpful diagnosis of how to deal with the sins of our fathers. And that has to be an exercise in gracious kind of truth-telling and listening to those who have suffered. It's a conversation that we kind of need to have. And I actually think the church is ahead of politics on this. You look at the amount of Christians in the Aboriginal churches who've led the way on this. Great heroes like William Cooper. If you don't know about William Cooper, hit Wikipedia and see his story. Legendary figures that we rightly should be putting up as heroes. But also seeing that there's a need for us to speak today into this situation. And if we're going to say it's about how do we deal with the sins of our fathers, then I think we need to hold a few things true. We need to say this really is sin that we're talking about. We need to say these really are our fathers. There is a connection that takes place. And the way that the scripture drives us normally there is to moments of confession, of repentance, of people being able to talk and reconcile, and people putting their final hope in a justice which is going to be brought about when the kingdom comes. Black and white, there has to be the future we have of saying, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. See, Christian hope has so much to speak into this moment. So how do you do that politically? Well, there's a few things we could say, and we might leave some of that to question and answer, to think about the mechanics of kind of the how. But the scriptures certainly call us to do at least three things. The first is to pray. Christians must pray for rulers, for those in authority. 1 Timothy 2 gives us a clear language about that, how we're to pray for them in order that we might be able to live quiet and godly lives. This pleases God, who wants all men to be saved. See, the rulers are the ones who we are to pray for in the middle of this. And it's very un-Australian. We're much better at tearing down rulers or of, building all our hopes in them if they're on our side. But instead, whoever they are, we're to be praying for them. The second thing I would say is be informed. Do look at William Cooper, read One Blood, talk to the Aboriginal Christians in your church and in your neighbourhood. And the third thing is to say, I think we need to then see some people actually be involved politically in this. What does it mean to be involved politically? Well, it's not all about Canberra and Parliament. I want to say politics is bigger than that. It can be just a discussion about how it is that we do life together. It can be the way you engage on social media. It can be the way that you get together in the P&F at the school or the workplace. It has to be really local and cultural and embedded long before it ever becomes law in Canberra. If we wait for politicians to do things, we'll be waiting kind of forever. It has to be a listening process. And there's still much to be done and much to learn here. Now, as I said at the start, this is very much just a basic kind of provisional start to where this might go. It's like sketching out the architecture of what the house might be, but we need to build the house. We need to think together what it means to live together well when there are big differences that would divide us. Because it seems at the moment that politics is pretty unhealthy. There's a fundamental kind of mistrust and polarisation that's taking place because all our hopes are being placed in politics to deliver justice. There's much to be done here. And there's much that Christians can do. This is not an impossible space to nudge the dial, to kind of make a difference. I think there are mistakes if we think that we can establish the kingdom of God through a political program, from left or right. That kind of utopian belief only leads to violence in the streets and terrible things. The 20th century, fascism and communism should show us that. Don't put your beliefs and hopes in men to be able to deliver that. But there's another mistake which I think evangelicals and Sydney evangelicals are particularly prone to, which is to put our hands up and say it's too hard, and just to withdraw and to back out and to say this is too complicated. Who are we to speak into that? And instead, we think faithfulness to God looks like being busy at church, and so we're involved in church in coming along when we're able to. In being part of a small group, in going away on a camp, and there's a disconnect between church and the rest of life. And that's a disconnect which some people are very happy to exploit. Some people are very happy to say, well, Christians, have your private religious belief, but don't speak into the public square. But what if that hadn't happened at Mile Creek? What if it didn't happen in the civil rights movement? What if Christians were silent then? See, there are times when Christians must speak their faith into the public square as Christians, and not captive to left or right. We'll want to be able to say a plague on both your houses. So we don't want to be triumphalistic and to say we'll deliver a Christian Australia through our politics. That's a misunderstanding. But we don't want to withdraw either. Instead, we kind of commit ourselves to a much messier process of saying making a difference means actually being involved, being present. It means loving your neighbour in the things that you do and in the things that you say. It's a lifelong process of saying we're in this together. It's saying that the church is not so different from the world that we've got nothing to offer. Instead, it's saying we have common ground. We have common understanding and desire for justice, and we have a contribution that we can make as citizens alongside other citizens who don't share Christian belief. But the great danger is that we withdraw and then we just tut at the terrible train crash that's kind of happening when Christians aren't speaking into the space. So there you go. There's some humble kind of offerings from someone who's got a lot to learn. And I think if we're able to talk together about how to graciously speak truth into a situation where there has been sin, our sin, our father's sin, and we need to be great lovers of the city around us. If we don't love this city, if you don't love Surry Hills, you just won't care, you'll never speak. But if you do, and if you really love the people who are around you, then you want to make sure that you're able to give reasons for the hope that you have. And as you speak, be assured that people will have questions, and they'll be really good ones.